All right, Sarah, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
I'm really glad to have been invited. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I've wanted to talk to a death doula about the depths of what can come up during a cancer diagnosis, the fears and everything that's surrounding death. It seems a little taboo to me. It's not talked about enough. And whenever we're faced with death all of a sudden, it's like, what do I do? So I'm so excited to have you here, but I want you to just take a second to introduce yourself. Who are you? What do you do? And how did you get into being a death doula?
Well, what do I do? I'm a death doula, and I also call myself a ritual healing practitioner because my death doula work is a little bit different than many other death doulas, and that I'm really focused on the spiritual and ceremonial aspects of it, and spiritual in the biggest version of that word, really, sort of from a nature-based spiritual perspective, is really where I come from. And I'm also a trainer. I have an online school training other death doulas, and offering courses and resources for people who are navigating death from any perspective, their own death of people I love. They want to support people through death. And in my work as a death doula, I work in a variety of different situations. There's sort of one category where people come to me where they're dying or someone they love is dying. And usually what happens is that at some point, either the medical system has said, this is where it's going and it's not going to get better, or people reach a certain age. At some point, people stop trying to go backwards and stay alive, and they turn and they look at what's ahead of them and they say, oh, death is coming. I don't really know how to do that, because we have a culture that is really good at helping us avoid death, but not very good at helping us actually know how to move towards it. So I often meet people when they've just taken that turn. Like, ooh, it's coming. I don't know how to do this. How can I do it? So the folks I work with really see death as part of their soul's journey. They see it as a sacred process, but they don't necessarily have a religious tradition or a spiritual tradition to guide them through it. So I sometimes call myself clergy for the unchurched. If you want to meet it in that spiritual sacred way, but don't have language or rituals for it, that's what I offer. So that's one kind of group of folks I work with, and I'll often work for several months with individuals and with families. I do now with Zoom, I do all these online events with the whole family or the extended family. And then I also work with people who are dealing with what I call deathly issues, which is really anything around a death. Oh, I have my mom's ashes and I've had them for 10 years and I know I should bury them, but I don't know how, or I don't really want, there's something tangled up around that. Or my father died by suicide and I'm really struggling with guilt and that.
Mhm.
Or the more metaphysical and transcendental, like um, dead people are talking to me and I'm not sure what to do about it. Or uh, I just talked to someone who lives in an apartment building. Someone jumped from a much higher window and landed on their balcony. And so
Mhm.
that's where the person died, and they found them. And now she has a sense that they're still somehow in her house. So really the whole spectrum, but I see the line between this side of the veil and the other is very transparent. So I
Yeah.
take that larger perspective that there is a transformation and a continuation of consciousness after death.
Crazy. What got you all started into this? I'm so curious what ignited that.
Came from a few different places. One was that my dad had a stroke, and he was 75. He had a stroke, and he'd been very healthy, and it was a sort of sudden shift
Yeah.
from being very agile and healthy to being really compromised. And he spent the next 7 years in a long-term care center,
Mm.
and that was such a shock. And I was, I don't know, my late 30s probably, and I had never had that kind of loss. And he didn't die, but it was a social death, and it was a death of the way our family had been. So I really, as I kind of caught my breath after that, realized that, oh, this is going to happen again. I need to get a little better informed about what's going to happen and how to meet it, because this is part of life.
Yeah.
So that's sort of the personal. And then um, academically, I've been studying, and academically and in informal ways too, been studying group process and spiritual healing practices and educational practices. I have a doctorate in transformative learning, really focusing on ritual. and I have a long history of sort of shamanic and energy medicine training. And the other world has always been pretty present to me, and I'm sensitive to those spiritual dynamics. And many people who are called to this work are super sensitive to non-ordinary information, energetic and spiritual information. So all those things kind of together took me onto this path.
Yeah, yeah, and I love that you teach other people how to become a death doula. It's something that I'm really interested in because of course my mom has terminal cancer and she has come so close so many times. Like the doctors at one point told us that maybe she has 2 days to live. And in that moment, I'm like, I know I'm going to be okay. Like, it's going to be a struggle. You're going to mourn and you're going to grieve. But I also was like really confused because I'm like, I don't know what to do in this space. Like, I don't know what to do here. I don't know what to do leading up to it. I don't know what questions I should ask her. People are saying, cherish every moment. And I don't know what that looks like. And it's really confusing. So, can you kind of riff on that a little bit? What we should do if we're faced with someone, because as soon as they get a terminal diagnosis, you start mourning them right away. And a lot of people don't notice that or don't know that. Right. And I started mourning my mom right away. And it's a process that I still go through to this day. But what is some advice that you would have for someone that is maybe leading up to, they know, like, if they are prepared enough to the final days of losing a loved one, and vice versa, like they're going to cross over soon?
Well, first of all, my heart goes out to you. That sounds like, I mean, having your mom have that diagnosis is rough, but having been up and down what sounds like a roller coaster is a big part of those challenges. So
Yeah.
good for you for turning this into some beauty, turning that grief into beauty. So, well, just a note, when my dad died about 2017, he died. And I had been in practice for many years by that point, and I still needed a death doula. So even though I knew what to do, there's a way grief makes you stupid. And it's just so overwhelming that trying to do it yourself
Mhm.
is almost impossible. I think we need community around us. So really I'm a big fan of having a death doula in every corner. We should just know this as part of our communities, the way people know how to can and garden and fix
Yeah.
your computer.
Or just how
Um,
we have a birth doulas. Like death
yes,
doulas are just as important as birth doulas. Going out of this world and coming in are just as important.
absolutely. So what is sort of some things to consider as people are looking at their dying time and seeing it coming? You know, there's a musician named Laurie Anderson was married to Lou Reed, also a big musician, and they were big meditators. And Lou died, and Laurie wrote about it in Rolling Stone magazine. And I just, it's a great place for a spiritual quote, but she's got a beautiful one. She talked about really that process of his conscious dying,
Mm.
and they're doing it together. And she said, I've come to believe that the purpose of death is the release of love. And so that can really be a kind of guiding principle when you're trying to decide what to do and how to do it. Is it serving love? Because death is hard and sad and difficult, but it's not wrong. We need to die, and we'd like to die later rather than sooner, but at some point we're all going to die. Our death makes space for something else to happen, but I also think there's another purpose in it, in that it brings us closer together. So as we're walking towards death for ourselves or with someone, whatever we can do to allow more love into the space. And the thing about love is that love and grief are two sides of the same ribbon. And you only grieve because you love.
Yeah.
And the amount of love and the amount of grief are equal. The more love, the more grief. So when we say we want to bring more love into the space, let death be a process of releasing love. One of the ways to do that is to make space for grief, because we can't have love really in its full expression, that profound connection we feel with each other, with the person who's dying, with the ancestors they're going to, unless we've also allowed the grief to flow, because the grief clogs things up. So whatever can be done to, in a contained and titrated way, make space for the movement of grief.
Yeah. And what would you say to someone that maybe they're in false hope or in resistance, denial?
It's hard. I have a lot of space in my heart for people in those situations because it is so hard. And we aren't prepared in any way. In dominant Western culture, we're so averse to discomfort. We don't even want to be uncomfortable, let alone present to the kind of incredible emotional pain that comes with dying and losing someone you love. So most of us have grown up saturated in this culture that says, don't do anything that doesn't feel good. And if it doesn't feel good, run the other way. And so dying doesn't feel good. Losing someone doesn't feel good. And so we've been acculturated to run the other way, to pretend it's not happening. So that's, I guess, sort of a corollary or qualifier to that. For people who have it, one of the things, I mean, it's everybody's different. So people will have denial and will have a kind of um, hope for a miracle for different reasons, and it depends why this particular person is holding this particular thing. And it can be anything from I'm terrified of dying, and then you actually ask them, well, what are they terrified of? And sometimes when people actually go down a couple of layers, they can't really name what they're afraid of. We have a culture that's created this fear around death, but what exactly are we afraid of? Ram Dass says that dying is like taking off a too tight shoe.
Mm-hmm.
He says it's safe. It's not going to hurt us. I mean, it's dying. It might hurt, but
Yeah.
it's not dangerous. Dying is not dangerous. And so sometimes people are in denial because at some level that they haven't even explored, they're terrified of dying, but when they explore it, they're not even really sure what they're terrified of. And maybe you can help them unpack, well, is this part actually dangerous? Is that dangerous? Is that, well, maybe it's hard and sad, but it's not dangerous. So one of the things I encourage people to do is to, another great line of be in unconditional cooperation with the unavoidable.
Yeah.
So when we can't avoid this, how do we cooperate with it? And it doesn't mean we can't have still a part of us that holds out, that maybe I will be one of those tiny percentage of people who do get this miraculous cure. But I'm not banking on that. I'm doing everything else I can to face the rest of it. And if that happens, well, that's icing on the cake.
Yeah, that's actually kind of the line that I straddle. I'm like, I believe in absolutely, I believe the body is miraculous. Like, I have no doubt in my mind. I know miracles are possible. People go into radical remission, but also at the same time, I don't want to be completely like blinding myself to the fact of the reality and then it coming up and hitting me twice as hard and me just being in denial. That's not healthy. And the avoidance is not okay. So, like you said, like the word surrender came through to my mind. Like, you must surrender. There's no shame in trying to do everything in your power to make, while they're still here, while you're still here, a better experience. But then also don't be in denial to the fact that it's going to hurt you more in the long run without leaning into it. So how do we cooperate with death?
It's it's interesting. Surrender is, and this is an answer to your question. Surrender is an interesting term, and it has a long, rich history in the spiritual literature about surrender and um, not fighting against. That's cooperating with the unavoidable. We don't fight against the truth or fight against reality. I think sometimes people who don't have a deeper sort of experience with the spiritual term surrender see surrender as a kind of, I don't know, like just lying backwards and giving up all agency or action and
Yeah.
letting it be done to them, which is
Right.
not what surrender in that spiritual way means. And acceptance is more that it's I surrender the fight. I am present with what is. and And there are things about death that we cannot control. There are lots of things about death we cannot control. We can't control when we die or how we die or how much it hurts or how old we are or can our kids make it in time to see us, all of that. But we do have some things we can have control over, or we can have influence over, I guess is a better way to put it. And one of the things I invite my clients to do is to get really clear about what their intention is for their death. What do you want it to be? For some people, they say, I want this to be sacred. I don't even really know what that means or how to do it, but I
Mhm.
know that I want this to be sacred. And okay, I can help you figure out what that means and how to do it if you know what you want. Or um, I want everybody in the family to love each other more. There to be more love as we do
Mhm.
this. Or people find their own language, but it's a kind of intention that does not depend on external circumstances. The death
Yeah.
can be, in many ways, awful. There are lots of awful ways to die, and especially even when it's been a sudden death. Right? That's another thing. You can still meet it in a way that's sacred. You can
Mhm.
still meet it in a way that brings love into the space. So cooperating with it is recognizing what you do have control and influence over, and what you don't, and releasing the need to control the things you cannot control,
Yeah.
but taking responsibility for the things that you do have impact over. So I'm going to do this in a way that allows me to be present to it. I'm not going to flinch. I'm not going to just cover my eyes and ignore the reality. I'm going to do the things that create beauty and community around it.
Yeah. Yeah. This reminds me whenever my mom was first diagnosed, I put her full into these like crazy diets and I was like filling her of supplements and it was coming from a place of fear. And that was making us both really sick. And once I switched over to coming from a place of love, and I have this perception now, it's been really helping me is that I look through a lens of if she has already passed and how grateful I would be if she like if I could just have one more second with her. So right now in this time leading up to potentially who knows, but just like taking appreciation and really like switching my energy for that. And it's really important to come from a place of love and not control and fear and denial and all that stuff. Okay, let's go back into more in the beginning. It sounds like you believe that there is a continual conscious.
Yes, and I believe it's a funny word. And, that's kind of the best word we have for it. But
Yeah.
it's it's like saying, "Do you believe in rocks?"
Yeah.
Like for me, that is just the reality of existence. That there
Mhm.
is some continuity of consciousness. There's some aspect of who we are that transcends our physical existence. It's it's the soul. It's the part of us that isn't our physical body, that isn't damaged by being ill, isn't damaged by dying. And I guess dominant Western culture is a pretty tiny minority when you look at cultures across the globe and through time. We're a pretty small percentage that say, that's it, there's nothing. And I actually think it's a bit arrogant of us to
Mhm.
believe that we know better than everybody through time, through space, that these other cultures in particular, like Tibetan Buddhism is a excellent example, but there are many, many cultures who have a deep, long tradition of spiritual research into the soul's journey.
Yeah.
And so that's why for me it's like it's not really belief, it's just what I experience with my clients in my own life and different situations, what my friends experience, that there's some part of us and it shows up in interesting ways. One of the sort of classic ways people can experience this, which is not that unusual, it doesn't happen for everybody, but during or around the time of someone's death, it's not unusual for the veil to open a little bit and there to be some mystical or transcendental phenomena that happen. People see their grandmother, or uh, have a sense or have a dream, or especially dying people because they're already 1 foot over. They have much more access to that. And I had a client who was hearing music coming out of her iPhone for hours. She'd be talking to people for hours. She'd say, "Oh, you hear that? Now it's switched. Now it's, South African a cappella choir. No, now it's, bluegrass." No, that she could hear it. It was completely real for her, but
Wow.
she was already attuned. It's like someone who's awake and asleep at the same time in the dream space. So that uh, aspect of reality, really is how I would describe it, is what makes death bearable.
Yeah.
Not only are we the tiny percentage that is convinced that there's nothing else, that because we haven't figured it out, it doesn't exist, we also are one of the tiny percentage that has a terrible relationship with death.
Yeah.
So, how do those go together? If we have a spiritual map of the soul's journey, if we have some sense of how our consciousness continues, then we can meet death in a better way. So for me, the two are hand in hand, that doing death well is about recognizing that we are more than our bodies.
Yeah, yeah. And you know what? There is something on Netflix right now. It's a series. I forget what it's called. It might be like Life After Death or something like that. I don't know if you recognize that, but I watched this series on Netflix and it was really eye-opening for me. And there's like mediums that are like channeling
Oh, yeah.
people's diet, like people that have crossed over. And there was this one story that kind of stuck with me. Is this one guy was like, he's talking to his dad. He's like, okay, if you're really gonna come through this medium, then I want you to say something about my hair. And the medium did that. He's like, at the end, he's like, oh yeah, your dad wanted to mention your hair. And that to me, just I'm like, there's no way that these people can make this stuff up. I mean, there are some people that could definitely in the past taken advantage. There's been scenarios that happens, right? So people become non-believers, but that really helped me cope with a lot of stuff going on, knowing that their consciousness continues. And they did like scientific studies where they measured it and could actually see it continue. And I'm like, that is the coolest thing. So that put me at ease with everything and made me more comfortable with the whole situation, because I kept saying, I'm like, well, my mom would just be a kick-ass guardian angel then, right? And she'd still be with me no matter what.
Yeah. Yes. And that, again, there's so much data, really, is what it is. If we're talking about scientific theories, saying there is something happening, something we could say it's inexplainable, or we could say it's happening. So these mediums can tell, and I've had the same experience of
Yeah.
profound, just a completely inexplicable information coming through mediums. The only explanation is they are talking to the dead person. It's not really inexplicable at all.
And they are. There's too many of them for it to be
Yeah.
not real. Okay, so what do death doulas do? When should someone contact a death doula? What is the role that they play? What can you account, like what can you rely on them for? What are all the works that death doulas do?
Well, there are different death doulas who do different things. I think about like a body worker. When 45 years ago, 50 years ago, when did like massage come on the scene as a really an established practice? There was a massage, that was it. And now the breadth of different kinds of body work is profound. So people have really differentiated. I kind of feel like we're at the massage version of death doula. It's just one kind, but it's going to grow and we're going to get more specific. So
Yeah.
mm, every death doula probably does something a little bit different, but in the categories of things that different death doulas do are helping you prepare emotionally for death, prepare logistically and physically. Like, what does that mean? How do you make a death plan?
Yeah.
Just like you would want a birth plan. And how does the death plan continue after the last breath? Because when someone's dying, understandably so, all the attention goes to the moment they die. And then there's a body in a bed.
Yeah.
If you're lucky enough not to have a sudden death, then what? So the death plan needs to continue that, and a death doula can help around that.
Yeah.
They also can help with, sometimes it's vigiling, sometimes it's bedside support, sometimes people are Reiki practitioners or aromatherapists or many, many different kinds of practitioners, and they bring that to their work. Some people help you do your paperwork. Some people help you leave legacy projects for your kids. Um, let's say my work is more spiritually focused. So people who study in some of these more pragmatic skills, they often come from teachers or have been hospice trained or they have a medical background. What they might come to me for is to learn some of the spiritual language and to be able to address people's spiritual questions. So having a breadth of exposure is important. And there are pet death doulas. I did that too when pets are being euthanized.
Oh,
Or,
I didn't even think
and,
about that.
oh yeah, and I actually work quite a bit with people around abortion and miscarriage
Mm, that's
because
a big
there's a death that's not spoken about. And how do we ritualize, especially ritualizing abortion?
yeah.
How do you do that in a way that is honoring of the soul that's being sent back and honoring of those who stay here? So
Yeah.
that's a different kind of death dueling.
Of course. Okay. Speaking of all these rituals, coming from your point of view and how you help facilitate these rituals, what do they look like? Give us kind of a brief idea.
It all depends um, what the ritual is. Sometimes they can look like pre-pandemic, mostly sitting around the coffee table in the living room
Mhm.
and coming in when death is in the space, someone in the family is dying, but nobody's really talking about it or
Right.
really talking about it very deeply.
Yeah.
So I come and we sit in a circle and I facilitate a conversation where we go deeper and deeper and we are able to talk about it. So I mean, to my sense, it's a ritual. It has some really classic ritual aspects to it. It doesn't look very ritualistic. So often they're more about the energy than what it looks like. It
Mhm.
might be a ritual. Someone's died. They're not keeping the body at home, and they're at a funeral home, and there's a viewing, and there's a casket closing.
Yeah.
So this is the last time people will see or be able to touch the body of the person they love. So I'll do a ceremony around that. It often involves flowers. And how do we actually close that?
Mhm.
With animal stuff, I'll come to the house with the vet and we'll do a ceremony at the moment of euthanasia. With, I do ceremonial body washing. How do you keep the body at home afterwards? And really slow that process down so
Yeah.
that you're able to integrate and catch up. And it's a spiritual ceremonial process of caring for the body. It can look all over the map. And
Yeah.
some of it is online on Zoom calls with people where we're doing rituals in the moment.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. Because I was reading when my mom first got diagnosed, Jan Arden's book, Feeding My Mom, and she had a death doula. And I loved maybe they did like a little prayer, and I don't even know, they had flowers and some stuff. And I just thought that was so great. And I'm like, we have a good traditional way of doing things, getting the casket and all that stuff, but sometimes it just doesn't jive with people. And I have always, like, I don't know, just done things differently in my life, and that just felt really like wholesome to me, and honoring and slowing down the process, like you said, because that moment whenever someone takes their last breath, like in that second, like I wouldn't even know what to do. I wouldn't know what to say. I wouldn't know where to go. I wouldn't know who to call. And that's why it's so important to have a death doula on your side, or at least someone, even if you do it virtually, just having someone communicate to you and supporting you through that process, because there's no way you should know what to do because you've never done it before. Hopefully, not very much. If so, we do want to make it special. We do want to make it sacred in your own way, whatever looks like that for everyone listening. Yeah. So anything you want to add to that, Sarah?
Well, no, just that the woman who death doulaed for Jan Arden was a student of mine.
No way. That's
Yeah,
amazing. Oh
yeah,
my gosh. Yeah.
yeah.
That's where I actually first heard of a death doula. And I'm like, why don't more people
Yeah.
talk about this? And that really, in that entire book, that's actually the one thing that really stuck out to me. It's the first book that I read when my mom was diagnosed. I went straight to Indigo and bought
Oh,
it. Yeah.
oh, beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah. So it kind of gave me almost like a sense of relief of taking that pressure off of myself for needing to know how to do everything. But yeah, there's like a couple instances, like my mom, she took a major seizure, and there it was awful. Like she took a 5 minute seizure, and most like average one is like 30 seconds to a minute, and hers was like 5 minutes long. So she was convulsing very intensely, and in that moment, like her eyes started going like completely blank, and then there's blood coming over her mouth, and I'm like, in my head I'm like, this is it, I don't know what to do. And this is it. Like, she's gone. And I just don't know what to do in that minute. So how, if anyone, if you're just kind of thinking about this, like, what could you give advice to for someone that might be going through this that doesn't have access to a death doula at the moment?
Um, well, there's like what to do. There's the medical part of it, there's the kind of logistical part of it, and there's the spiritual part of it. And people study for a long time to be hospice nurses and hospice physicians and even hospice aides. So the medical part, hopefully you're well supported by palliative or hospice care. And I just can't say enough good things about hospice care and palliative. I know sometimes people are resistant to going there because they think it's, I don't know, speeding death up, when in fact it's exactly the opposite. Often people get better because the care is so different and it's such a relief. You're not in a fighting zone anymore, you're in a nurturing zone. So hopefully medically, whether you have a death doula or not, and really a death doula is not a medical practitioner, so that's not where people's skills would be. The medical can covered with the hospice and palliative care. um, the practical and pragmatic, there are lots of resources online. I have courses, other people have courses and books and resources about how to make a plan.
Mhm.
Perhaps if you're involved with the hospice, you could be in touch with the social workers. They can also help a lot around that. So a big part of it is emotionally preparing yourself
Yeah.
so that it's still going to be shocking, it's still going to be overwhelming, but hopefully it's not as shocking or as overwhelming. And um, and you have a sense of what's coming, and you've actually thought about it. You've thought, okay, when she takes her last breath, you kind of pre-play it in your head. Nobody wants to think about that, but if you pre-play it a little bit, when it gets there, you're better prepared. And pre-playing it does not make it come sooner. It just makes it easier when it does come.
Yeah.
So that's the pragmatic. And then the third is the spiritual. And that, again, is learning. If you have a religious tradition that speaks to you, clergy can be helpful for that. There are lots of therapists who can bring a spiritual lens to it. Not all of them, you'd have to find the right one around that. Um, Doing some reading, there's some good books out there now. But even if just you break it down into those three parts, there's the medical, the pragmatic, and the spiritual. How am I going to educate myself on each of those?
Yeah. Yeah. I love that you said just visualize it going through, because a lot of us will, like we already talked about, there's a lot of resistance around that. But the way our brain is wired is it actually does, if it recognizes something, then it won't resist it and won't, like, it won't be as hard to, I think the biggest thing is like, will I be able to handle this? That's where the biggest fear comes from. And absolutely, we are equipped to deal with death because it is part of human life. We can't avoid it. Right. So, yeah.
And we're able to handle it, but we're not able to handle it alone. It's
Yes.
too big to handle alone.
Yes.
So when people ask me, how do I have a good death? No matter how young or healthy you are, now start building your community. Start building the network of people who you know and love and who know and love you, so that when the time comes, you have that network. Because it takes a lot of emotional energy, it takes a lot of physical, pragmatic energy to navigate through illness and dying and death, or sudden death also.
Yeah.
So we can do it, but if we don't have support in terms of people around us and support in terms of skilled practitioners, death doulas, grief counselors, therapists, social workers, all of those people, if they're in a hospice track, they will be able to help, and we need that around us. So I can't speak highly enough of finding somebody who's had some expertise in this, who can help you walk through it, because it can be too much if you
Mm.
don't have that kind of support.
Yeah. Yeah. And you won't regret ever getting more support than, there's no such thing. You can never get too much support from
Yeah.
anything like this. Right. So, yeah. Oh, Sarah, thank you so much. This has been so amazing. I wanted to pivot a little bit because you were definitely, my like intuition was like, Mazina, you need to reach out to Sarah. I don't know what it was about you. And then you shared with me that you had a cancer story as well. And I'm like, no wonder my intuition was going absolutely crazy, because you can definitely relate to this scope in a sense of getting the diagnosis. So do you mind sharing your story?
Sure. No, yeah, it was, I was not expecting it, and like most people aren't. So in
Yeah.
2019, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. They found a lump in my left breast, and I had surgery and went through some of the treatment processes. They didn't recommend chemo. And I thought I was out of the woods. And then a year and a half later, I had a screening mammogram, and they found another lump in the same place, two little ones, in fact. And so I had surgery again and more treatment. And now it's whatever it is, 2022, and I've been discharged from the oncological system, and hopefully I'm home free. I just had a clear mammogram. So, that's the quick story. The reality is it's been a huge spiritual and emotional journey. And it's given me incredible, an even deeper level, I think, of empathy for my clients and for family and friends. For me, it was really a question of meeting the cancer as a kind of wake up call that had a message for me. It was telling me something about something in my life that was out of balance.
Mhm.
And what did I need to do to address that? And I had lots of alternative and mainstream support and treatment, but even deeper, or in addition, I guess, is really looking at the patterns in my life. And for different people, those patterns will be different. Maybe they're physical practices, or maybe you're in a stressful job or a stressful relationship, or need to do some emotional healing work, or what is not in balance that my body is making such a ruckus to draw
Yeah.
my attention to it.
Yeah.
So that's really been my path through it, is taking it as a huge opportunity for learning and growth. And I wouldn't wish it on anybody, and I wouldn't have wanted it myself, but I've had it, and what it's given me in terms of a space to grow and evolve has been pretty profound, and an incredible, even deeper gratitude for being alive.
Yeah, yeah. I watched your videos that you posted on your
Oh,
blog about them, and your perspective and your mindset, and just like not going to the victim mode. Like you wouldn't even go there. You wouldn't even allow yourself to go there. And it was just so refreshing to watch you talk about it. And I'm like, oh my gosh, Sarah definitely has a good perspective on it, because a lot of people go into, woe is me, why is this happening to me? But it is really important to reverse that all and look at, where in my life am I out of alignment? What is my body trying to tell me? And it's so interesting. Whenever my mom was diagnosed, I had this oracle deck, and I kept pulling this card. It said, you've been preparing for this for a lifetime. And I truly believe, there's this quote that I live by, and I'm not like extremely like Christian by any means. I'm definitely very spiritual. I grew up in a Christian household, but the quote is, God would never give, or God only gives his hardest battles to his strongest warriors. And I kept saying that through my head, and it's just there to teach you something. And again, like, you just have a more appreciation for life, and you're a freaking death doula.
yeah. And
Yeah.
it's not that I didn't grieve. It's not that I didn't have lots of strong emotions and sadness and all sorts of things, but it, you're right. It wasn't the, why is this happening to me, or this shouldn't be happening to me, or it's not fair that this is happening to me. That story just wasn't even part of it,
Yeah.
because there's enough going on. That story is unnecessary, untrue, and just a distraction. Let's just be with what's really happening, which is that it is happening. We don't need to play the victim in there too. It just adds a layer of complication that doesn't serve anything.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, we are on our last couple minutes, but I'm curious, if someone were to find out that they were diagnosed with maybe as severe as terminal cancer, or not terminal cancer, but just they were just diagnosed with cancer, or they have someone, a loved one that was diagnosed with cancer, what would you say to them in that moment? What advice would you give to them right now?
You know, I don't even know if I'd give advice in that moment. People are so, their world has been exploded. They aren't even in the place to be able to receive advice. What they need is someone to hold the space for
Yeah.
them to just catch their breath and start to find the pieces that used to be shaped like a life, and suddenly that life has been exploded.
Hmm.
So if there's advice, it's find someone to help you process it.
Yeah.
Just, I mean, of course you know this, it's, there's the emotional experience of it, and then there's the full-time job of being a patient, and the tests and the records and the appointments and who's phoning who and what is it like that. So I guess it's another way of saying the same thing, but get support. Get support from someone who can hold a container for your emotional process and your spiritual process, and get support for people who can support the physical process, who can drive you to appointments so you don't have to figure out how to navigate the parking lot in the hospital. Like I just couldn't, it was just more than I could manage. Just
I
did that. So you need someone to drive you. So get help. Get help, get help, get help.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And the biggest thing whenever that happens, you're not just mourning potentially the death of someone, you're mourning life as it was too,
Yeah.
right? That's coming up and it will never go back to being the same. And that is definitely something that I experienced when people were flooding my messages and comments and just they were trying to help me, but it just wasn't really like some things that they were saying weren't helpful. And the best things that were being said was, when can I do this? And not giving me an open-ended question of like where I had to respond and like make up my own mind because I'm like, I don't even know what I need right now. Like I'm just in shambles and
Yeah.
I just need someone to get on the phone with me and listen to me cry or whatever that might look like. And there's no shame in that, right? And that was the biggest thing. I think I thought I was a burden. Like I felt like a burden and I distanced myself from people, and I also felt people distancing themselves from me too. So that was a big thing, but definitely don't be afraid to get support.
And there are people who won't be able to handle it,
Yeah.
and we just bless them. But
Yeah.
for people in our lives who are really able to be there for us, and if you're that kind of person yourself, you know that if someone asks you and you can do it, it's not a burden, it's a gift to be able to support someone in that way.
Mhm. 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 Well, Sarah, you are just a wealth of knowledge, and I am so just grateful and honored to have you here. Thank you so much for coming on to the show. And hopefully, for everyone listening, you got so much value from this because I definitely did. But I will let you go. We'll end it here. And yeah, I thank you so much again.
You're very welcome. I appreciate your questions, and all the best to you and to your mom.
Thank you.